Hello and welcome to Blogging Heads. This is Hanna Rosin. I am the co-editor of Double X, which is the women's page in Slate, and also a contributing writer for The Atlantic. And I am here with Judith Shulevitz today. Hi, Judith.
Hey, Hannah.
Judith has a new book out called The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time, which is a fascinating book about her relationship with the Sabbath, all of our relationships with the Sabbath, more as sort of an idea than the actual Sabbath itself. And Judith, I want to jump right in here. I know Judith, but there's all sorts of things in here I did not know about you, including your biography, which are great and really interesting. And the book starts out by saying that we all look for a Sabbath, and it's a very interesting way to put it because it conveys a certain kind of non-completeness and ambivalence and a sense of kind of we all look for but don't necessarily find. So why don't we just start by saying sort of how did you grow up? What was a Sabbath to you as you were growing up?
Well, the Sabbath to me as I was growing up was a time of contention, unpleasantness, and unfulfilled longing. So it was a weird choice to write about the Sabbath because, frankly, Saturday was the worst day of the week in my household.
And this had to do with your mother, right?
This had to do with my mother. I tell this story in the book, and the story is that when I was 5, we moved from Detroit, where my mother was part of a close-knit, loving family group, to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where my dad was starting a business. And my mom was furious, and she found it very difficult to be Jewish, to raise her children in a Jewish fashion. And Saturday was somehow the day when all of this, her rage at being there, my father's resentment at her resentment, came to a head. We'd be dragged off to synagogue. He would not come. On Friday nights when we lit the candles, he fiddled impatiently with the silverware. It was a tense and unpleasant time. It was awful. It was just the moment. It was like everything stopped. We weren't working. You know, it was that wonderful moment of family togetherness when all the family closeness can sort of wrap itself around you, except, of course, our family wasn't getting along. So it was awful.
You know, of course, all horrible moments bring great revelations. I mean, one of this sort of, it's a very enduring image of, you know, you being unhappy and yet finding your Sabbath, because it's the moment in the book when Sabbath, you know, becomes kind of a metaphor, something you're searching for rather than like what Jews do on a Saturday, you know? And I have that moment of little Judith crouching by the refrigerator, but maybe you can just say what was going on.
I'm going to be very honest with you and say I wanted to start with something you would not expect as the beginning of a book on the Sabbath, which is me crouched on Saturday mornings behind a giant freezer full of frozen kosher meat.
Right.
My mother used to have the meat flown in from Miami, and once, I'll just tell you this, it was hijacked to Cuba. It arrived 5 days late, completely rotten. That, however, did not make it into the freezer. So anyway, there was something about this freezer that I interpreted as a connection to the mainland, which I missed bitterly. I missed my mother. I missed my happy mother. I missed my grandparents. I missed my cousins. And
maybe you missed fluctuating weather, too.
I did. I really, really did. And it became my own sort of personal altar to the Midwest, where I had come from, which is, I'd come from Detroit. And I use it as a way of talking about the way we're looking for some lost sense of completeness.
Right.
And the Sabbath becomes a home in time. You know, Heschel called it a cathedral in time. I think of it more as a home in time.
And there's so many things that are raised by that moment. I mean, not just that everybody looks for their own Sabbath and finds it in different ways, but also the interior nature of it. I mean, I grew up thinking of the Sabbath as something so, you know, communal. It's like you go someplace, there are lots of people, you do certain things. It does, the interiority of it is not something that it's something that comes up in the book, you know, over and over in a beautiful way, but that also you know, you're there by yourself, like literally wedged into a corner next to the freezer. It's a very kind of internal and slightly mad experience that nobody looking at you would pick up or understand or find comfort from.
I was running away from my mother's and my father's and my family's contested, tense, difficult, alienated Sabbath and looking for a Sabbath. And I think, you know, first of all, I'd had this sense of being part of a family, right? I'd been taken from it. And second of all, I was a good little Jewish girl. I was being sent to Sunday school, and after-school Hebrew school, and I knew that there was this thing called the Sabbath, and I knew that my mother loved it very, very, very much, though I couldn't for the life of me imagine why. And I knew there was some sense of comfort that was to be gotten from it. And one of the things the Sabbath gets taken as an example of is the very social nature and communal nature of Judaism,
right?
Which is true, and I talk a lot about that. The Sabbath is we can talk about that later. The Sabbath is a sort of machine for manufacturing social solidarity, but it wouldn't be so powerful a utopian ideal, a longing, and such a powerful conveyance of the longing for closeness with God and with one's community, if it didn't do something to you inside.
Right.
Very powerful inside.
Right. And then we maybe we'll get around to the story of Hanna later, since we both share that name, but that's one of the stories that powerfully conveys this notion of, sort of the internal profundity of, prayer and the Sabbath. So we have you in that freezer, which, by the way, I sort of, in my head, have already turned into kind of a page in a graphic novel. It's just crouching by the freezer and a bubble over your head, so maybe we can get somebody to draw it. But so clearly there's an ambivalence around this and a sort of non-completeness. So I just want to talk about kind of, what the Sabbath is, just a little primer to the Sabbath. And, the thing that makes many of us ambivalent about the Sabbath, and that has to do with the rituals, kind of, the sort of kind of idiotic ritual nature of it. I mean, as you said at one point, you think about it and it bores you to tears or something like that. Like, that's what people think Jews do on the Sabbath. They do these kind of inane, necessary little things, and then they absolutely don't do other things. And, that leads into a riff about Kafka and Kierkegaard and Abraham, which is also quite wonderful. But just talk about that, the kind of rituals and what they mean and why they're maddening.
Ritual has two forms. There are ritual proscriptions and ritual prescriptions. Not to get too highfalutin about it, I just want to make it clear that there are some things ritual tells you to do, and then there are some things that religious law, which is slightly different, tells you can't do. And there are a lot of laws in Jewish law about the Sabbath. In fact, the book of the Talmud, it's called a tractate, of the Talmud devoted to the Sabbath is the biggest of the many very large tractates of the Talmud, because there are so many rules about what you cannot do, and some rules about what you must do. So one of the difficulties I have with the Sabbath is there's so many things you cannot do.
Right.
And
such as, just lay them out for people who don't necessarily know. Like, what can you not do?
Well,
it's not
they're all derived from 39 rules, which are taken from the building of the temple in the Bible. But that's a whole other story. The things you cannot do that everybody knows about are, you cannot extinguish or light a fire, which translates into you cannot turn on lights, you cannot boil water for your coffee in the morning, you cannot drive a car. You cannot carry things unless you happen to be inside, and this gets complicated, but unless you happen to be inside something called an eruv, which is this boundary made just for the purpose of allowing people to carry things within it.
Say an umbrella being the
famous
example.
Umbrella, or more controversially and problematically, your baby.
Right.
Synagogue,
Right.
Big
right.
issue. Big issue. You cannot cut. You cannot write. Basically, the laws boil down to this one thing: you cannot make anything intentionally.
Right.
Or unmake it in a productive fashion.
Right. Which can be, I mean, when you think about it, either sort of inane, hidebound, like anachronistic, or a sort of quite beautiful respite from, our crazy world, which is, those are the two sort of simplistic understandings of what all those rituals are for.
Right. I mean, the fundamental philosophical understanding that I believe it is meant to promote. And I think that you can actually do a read, even though it sounds very modern what I'm about to say, I think you can actually read the rabbis as having meant to say this, is you must not make the world bend to your will. You must not have an instrumental relationship to things or to animals or to people, right? You must let your servants rest. And in one of the yet to be fully exploited aspects of the Sabbath, you cannot work your beasts.
Right.
You cannot exploit your beasts. So,
well, our beasts are our blackberries now. I mean, you have much more kind of profound things that draw you to, in a way, the Sabbath. But I think the most superficial thing for many Jews is just this, the notion of being drawn away from our beasts, whatever our beasts are, the computers or blackberries or whatever.
Right. I don't think that's unprofound. I think that's really profound and really complicated. I talk in the book about how blackberries and the internet are contributing to an erosion of the boundaries of time. The traditional night, day, work, rest, play, sleep. All of this, there's many things contributing to the very rapid erosion of these traditional boundaries. But I would say the incessant availability of technologies of communication is a very powerful one. And I think it's tremendously stressful, and it's a big shift in the way we live. And
right, that phrase "mobile time." I actually don't want to talk about it quite yet because there's a whole section. One of the most interesting things about the book is just kind of bringing to the surface notions of time and the morality of time, things that we a kind of architecture we don't necessarily think about or have ever surfaced, which is so interesting. I mean, that the fundamental ways in which we divide our days, are they prescripted by nature, or are they things that sort of a religious calendar is put into place, and sort of what do they mean? And anyway, but let me just finish about the rituals. I loved the Abraham, the various, the notions of Abraham really, I think, got at many different, sort of Abraham as tax collector, and Abraham as person who really can't sort of get away from the rituals as a kind of comic figure. Can you just talk about him a little bit?
Well, Kierkegaard, I wanted to talk about Kierkegaard, and I started writing about Kierkegaard in a way to excuse myself for not having gone out and interviewed vast numbers of people who keep the Sabbath and write a completely different kind of book. Because, as you know, Hannah, I move in a very journalistic milieu, and there's something slightly, wrong about that.
Right.
I did actually go spend a lot of Sabbaths with a lot of people, and I just thought, I don't want to write the traditional scenes here. I have scenes, but they tend to be autobiographical.
I have to say it's hard. Having written about religion, I find the writing of the religious scene almost like the writing about sex. It's just, I find it impossible to do in a fresh or interesting, the sort of newspaper lead or whatever, describing a kind of, it's very hard.
Very hard to do it from the outside. There's just such rich meaning in every single gesture. And, unless you're writing this very, very expansive, deconstructed prose, it's really, really hard to do, which is why I quote Alice Munro saying, you can really only do this from the inside.
Right, which was very interesting. I was comforted by that. I thought that was very interesting. We can never understand.
Liz Harris wrote this book. We're getting off the topic, but she wrote this book called Holy Days, which is about her time spent with the Lubavitch family in Crown Heights. And she has beautiful Sabbath scenes, and that is because they are so deeply and richly embedded in this matrix of meaning.
Right.
That by the time they show up, you know everybody, you know exactly what the Sabbath means to them, you see the different ways in which they keep it. She's very good, the revelations she has about her life as a result of being there come to her as a result of a relationship that's already been drawn. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
It really is a tough thing to do if you can't do all that.
Yes.
Anyway, Abraham... I wanted to talk about ambivalence about ritual, because Kierkegaard comes up. Kierkegaard is he's a religious philosopher, and he's a philosopher who's very skeptical about religion. And he makes religion seem to be, or religious faith, seem to be the completely impossible thing, but the necessary and desirable thing. And that echoes my own ambivalence. So I was very drawn to Kierkegaard when I was writing this book, and I was very drawn to this figure of the knight of faith. It's not actually, Kierkegaard doesn't call him Abraham. He calls him the knight of faith, and he's like a bourgeois, small town, maybe fishmonger, who turns out to have perfect contentedness and wholeness and a sense of faith. And I talk about, and it becomes, he's trying to believe in this man as the knight of faith, and as it goes on, it becomes clear he can't, because Kierkegaard is a very ironic figure and skeptical figure, and he just can't really believe in this figure, and you begin to see him as a caricature.
Yeah, can I just interject? This is so. One of the reasons I love this discussion is because having spent a lot of time with young Christians, the sort of ironic kind of gap in this story is completely lost. I mean, Night of Faith is a concept that lives very strong. It's almost like the sort of slight misunderstanding of Job and kind of his relationship to God and how he behaves. It's a very powerful idea to young Christians. Kierkegaard's Night of Faith. It's something they talk about.
They do talk about it, but do they acknowledge that it's basically impossible?
No, that's why I love this discussion. No, they do not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So Kafka. So this Night of Faith shows up. Kierkegaard is talking about what it would mean to believe, and he invents this Night of Faith. This man who's perfectly, fully, wholly in his skin and at ease with his faith, doesn't question it at all. He invents this fellow after he's talked about Abraham, who is the true Knight of Faith, right? He who offered up without, we don't know without questioning, but certainly without pause, his son, when asked by God to sacrifice his son. And Kafka, who loved this book, realized that the Knight of Faith was a sort of modern iteration of Abraham. And that as he moves from the Abraham the sublime, the Kierkegaard sublime figure, to this sort of fishmonger, German fishmonger in a small village, who smokes his pipe and sings lustily in church and chats with his neighbors, you go from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Right.
And you go, really, from this Christian ideal of faith to this very Jewish idea of faith, because he's very Hamish.
Right.
He's very domestic. He cares about the small things, and he's always sort of worrying about getting everything ready and making sure it's right. And then Kafka points out that Kierkegaard's Abraham really should have been like that Abraham isn't this sublime man of faith. He's actually this obsessive-compulsive who was always busily getting ready for the test that God was about to give him. And he paints this very comic figure. And it's meant to show the difference between the Jewish idea of what is sublimely religious and the Christian idea of what is sublimely religious. One very noble and sublime, and one sort of very detail-obsessed.
Right. Where
this is the thing, that being obsessed with details is one of the things Christians, sort of a charge Christians levied against Jews.
Right.
And the Sabbath was one of the prime examples of that.
Right, and still is. I mean, to this day, the idea that Jesus banished the need for this, and we'll talk about Christians' relationship to the Sabbath a little bit later. But yes, the idea of sort of, Abraham kind of constantly looping around and getting prepared. That was all about the getting prepared. And is this idea of Jews getting sort of stuck in a place, sort of, and never getting to the next place beyond time, that's
right, because, in fact, this isn't even in the book, so I'm not supposed to talk about it. But anyway, the Sabbath, there's a whole literature about how Jesus came to replace the Sabbath. Not just in the sense that he banished it, but in the sense that he is the Sabbath principle of redemption.
Right.
And so it's this one-time redemption that's very glorious.
Right.
And Jews, on the other hand, have this Sabbath every week.
Right.
And they never get enough of it.
Right.
And it just gets stricter and stricter. You know what I mean? And it seems very petty. If your frame of reference is grand and it's apocalyptic and it features sort of the end of time and what's going to happen, and the Jewish frame of reference, which is every 7 days, seems very, very small.
Right. And but also sort of an ever diminishing, approach to perfection, which you never quite get to, Let's talk about now that we've disrespected the ritual. Maybe let's sort of return to some of the beauties of it in a kind of primer on Sabbath, and then I want to talk about the history and origins. But you talk an aftertaste of infancy. I thought was a very beautiful phrase. What did you mean by that?
I was referring in that phrase specifically to a Kabbalistic concept, the neshama yetera, which is the oversoul. Essentially, there's a Sabbath soul that descends upon you and takes you over and sort of, elevates your weekly soul. And it's a way, I think, of talking about that experience of wholeness, of being one with God or one with your family or one with yourself. That is what you're looking for on the Sabbath. And the Kabbalists were brilliant at coming up with these metaphors, which in in the way that they had of going ever further than you ever thought they could. They didn't think were metaphors; they thought were literally true. That describe this spiritual longing that the Sabbath represents. So that's I was after Taste of Infancy. I was talking about this idea of being held, wholly held, and contained. And there is something to that. The Sabbath, this idea of the 20. It's actually 25 hours in Judaism. The 25 hours in which, sort of God enters and holds you and fills the world with sacredness. It's a kind of maternal image.
And why is it necessary to kind of put everything aside in order for that to happen? Sort of why are the rituals necessary to creating such a feeling of wholeness or comfortedness or communalness?
There's almost a Buddhist aspect to it, I think. You're supposed to empty yourself of the mundane thoughts of work, of survival, of ambition. Anything that smacks of scheming or instrumentalism or getting ahead, you're supposed to set aside.
Right.
But also you're supposed to sort of rise above. And one of the things I like about the laws is many of the rules about what you can and cannot do derive from agricultural laws. And this was an agricultural society. So what they were forbidding were the basic means of subsistence, 1 day a week. And that they thought, even though they can't possibly have really, many of them can have lived above the means of subsistence, that they thought it was important enough to put that aside 1 day a week. It says to me, this was really important to them. They really thought they had to get beyond this if they were going to live a holy life.
Right.
So you had to put all that aside, and then you had to direct. The reason there are all these rules about praying and lighting candles and eating and blessing the food afterward and things like that are so that you direct your mind toward God.
Right. And comes from creation. I mean, I wanted to talk more thoroughly about the various, you have a few sections on the origins of the Sabbath, sort of the exile, the river, there's lots of beautiful stories about where the Sabbath comes from. But why don't we talk about creation, since that's, the one that most people know. God rested on the seventh day, and what does that mean? And you have a good sort of discussion of what that actually means, and why did he rest? Because it seems like, why didn't he have a party? I mean, it seems fairly anticlimactic.
Right. I mean, so in the Enuma Elish, which is the preceding and competing Babylonian epic, after the gods create the world, they then have a party. And it occurs to them that if they're going to have the party, they need some servants. So they enslave man to do their work for them. And, there are scholars who say the reason God rests is in a certain sense to emphasize the difference between this creation narrative and that one. Here, God rests so that mankind can rest. He gives mankind the Sabbath. The reason God rests, the reason creation happens in 7 days and God rests, is a mystery. It's a mystery I don't solve, I don't think. I suggest answers, but it is one of the great mysteries. What is the Sabbath doing there? Where does it fit into the order of creation? The way the creation story is told, in a formal sense, everything leads up to, in terms of rhythm, in terms of diction, and in terms of just the way the sentences are ordered, everything seems to lead up to this giant climax, which is the Sabbath. Right. But what the hell is it? Right. What is God doing when he's resting? And I have a little story I tell, something called a midrash, which is a rabbinic legend. I make up my own, in which I speculate what God is doing when he's resting, and that is missing the drama of Adam and Eve eating the apple.
That's good, yeah.
And, it's just an example of how when God withdraws, even God gets to withdraw. Lovely image, we're supposed to imitate God. But when God withdraws from his just hatched creations, he abandons them to their own devices, and we have the fall. It's sort of the central tragedy. And it's, I always am looking for stories in the stories that will reflect my ambivalence, because we can talk about that too. I love the Sabbath very deeply, and I long for it. And there are things about it I hate, and I've hated all my life.
Right. I mean, I think that's what animates the book. I mean, that's what makes the book great, is a very sort of sincere longing, but also a kind of deep ambivalence, which you don't. I mean, as you talk about in the beginning, there's a journey in this book, but it's an intellectual journey, and it's not a journey in which the traditional journey in which you start in ambivalence and then you wind up somewhere else, you know? You start in ambivalence, you end in a kind of deeper, more profound and more interesting ambivalence, and, you know, still actually, still respecting the Sabbath, but in sort of slightly different ways. I love the story, by the way, about the rabbi who didn't know what day the Sabbath was. I found that very...
Well, it's not a rabbi.
moving.
It's a story rabbis tell about a traveler in the desert.
Uh-huh.
This very long tractate of the Talmud is devoted to all these questions about what happens if? What happens if you forget to light the candles on time? What do you do? What happens if you inadvertently carry when you're not supposed to? What then? It's a favorite way rabbis have. It's a way rabbis have of talking to each other, sort of finding the outer limits of the rules. You know,
right.
It's their mode of legal discourse. So there's this one story that I make much of, which is what happens if there's a traveler in the desert and he loses track of time.
But that's to take the question to the nth is already so interesting. It reminded me of those Lucinda Williams lyrics. It's like, I changed the lock on my front door. I changed the name of this town. It's like, ultimately, you just kind of completely dislocate yourself, you know, so you're sort of totally dislocated in time. You're not talking about a little thing, like, what if I accidentally carried something? Suddenly you don't even know what day
where you are. I
right.
mean, it's an amazing image, and that happens, by the way, to be one of my favorite songs of all time.
But I like, you know what I mean, but she goes from the specific, you get the sense of power at the end there, you know. Anyway.
So one of the wonderful things about the Talmud is rabbis come up with these incredibly potent little stories and then act as though they haven't, right? So that not much is made of this sort of astonishing circumstance that one could be in,
right?
Where one is so far and remote from civilization that one doesn't know what day it is,
right?
And then they proceed to give some answers which just deepen the extremity of the situation, because they say, well, what do you do then? Well, some rabbis say you should celebrate the Sabbath right away, count 1, right, and
right.
then and celebrate the Sabbath, and then count 6 after that. And some rabbis say, no. You count 6 from the time you realize you don't know what day it is, and then you celebrate the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And one thing this teaches us, actually, is that the Sabbath is not necessarily... the rabbis didn't believe that the Sabbath reflected the absolute 100% pure order of time. It wasn't an absolute notion of time. It's not like they believed there was a Sabbath, God kept it, we keep it, it must always be kept on that day. Mm-hmm. They understood that it was sort of contingent, that human time was different from God's time, and that, you could kind of fudge it. Not that they let you fudge it very often, but this one little story comes to show that they didn't believe in absolute divine time. They believed in human time, that we're celebrating Sabbath on human time.
Right.
But the other thing it comes to show is, well, first of all, there's this idea that this guy is lost for so long that, he can count 1 and then 6 and then keep going like that. Like, how lost is this guy?
Right.
What is that? I mean, what is this story
And they
about?
don't pause on that, right?
No, they don't pause. They just keep going because they're not really interested in the real situation, though I am.
Right.
But what's this argument about 6 plus 1, 1 plus 6? Like, who cares about 6 plus 1 and 1 plus 6? Well, finally someone comes along and explains why this matters. Because if you count 1 and then count and keep the Sabbath and then count 6, you are like Adam. You are like the first man. And if you count 6 and then 1, you are like God. You are like God performing the act of creation.
Right.
And what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to be like God.
Right.
Because what are you doing when what happens when you're so lost, you're so cut off, that there's nothing. There's nothing. You have to just recreate the world. And
right.
The first thing you do when you recreate the world is you create the Sabbath.
Right. I thought that was a very empathetic answer. I mean, it sort of give you license to do that. So you can recreate a kind of order,
Yes.
You can go from sort of extreme lostness to kind of extreme omnipotence and control,
That's right.
You
create an order of time. The order of time turns out to be more important than anything else. It's
right.
The first thing you have to create is the order of time.
Right. So this is a natural transition to, a concept that you talk about, which I think, has applicability to so many different areas. I mean, you've written for Double X a little bit about sort of motherhood and time, but I think there's social morality of time. I mean, what do you mean by the social morality of time? And you can illustrate using the very kind of literal experiment that you mentioned of sort of what's time worth and what are the ethics of it.
Right. Oh, right. Yes. Well,
it's
what I mean by the
literal,
social morality of time is very simple. It's a cool phrase that I make much of because my husband utters it in the first, few pages of the book. But what I mean, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, sorry,
yeah.
There was a click. What I mean is that the way we organize our time as a society has moral meaning. It
right.
means something morally. It can make us better or worse. If we to boil it down to the very simplest, if we make time for each other, we will be a better society.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't make time for each other, and we only have time for ourselves, or we only have time for our work, or we only have time to make ourselves richer, we will be a worse society. That's
and why
what I mean
time as opposed to sort of money or any other way in which you can, show love to people? Why time? What's the meaning of time?
Time is, you talked about liking the idea of the architecture of time.
Right.
Time is where we spend time with each other. You know what I mean?
Right.
Time is the structure of time makes it possible for us to be together, or it does not make it possible for us to be together. I'll give you an example. In the Soviet Union, at one point, Stalin decided to get rid of the 7-day week.
Mm-hmm.
He turned it into a 5-day week. Now, this may have been in order to get rid of Saturday and Sunday because he was anti-religious.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, then with the 5-day week, what he did is he divided society into 5 different segments. And they were color-coded, interestingly.
Mm-hmm.
Orange, and blue, and red. And you were orange, you were blue, or you were red. And what that meant is you got your vacation on a different day.
That's interesting. Uh-huh.
And then he proceeded to, he didn't, sort of say, okay, Moscow is going to be red and Leningrad is going to be orange. No, he divided families, he divided workplaces into these different groups. So that the idea was to have what was called in Russian a continuous work week. So that, basically everything was speeding up, they were industrializing, they needed continuous work. But it was a complete disaster. It broke families apart. Mm-hmm. It destroyed civil society, institutions and civil societies, cinemas, bars, of course, churches, not surprisingly. All these things had a terrible time attracting, on any given day, enough people to function. But worst of all, of course, was the effect on families. Because, women were working, and men, of course, were also working. And rarely did men and women take the same day off. So they could never be together.
Now, is that intentionally sort of to shift your loyalties such that you understand you're ultimately beholden to the state? In other words, it does surface all these things about time and sort of what time creates loyalties, like shared time creates loyalties.
Yes, shared time creates loyalties. That's very, very true. It is felt that probably, the Marxists, the communists were not very pro-family either. So this was probably a means of breaking up, undermining the family from the inside.
Right.
But it gives you, it's an example at the extreme. It was a disaster. It lasted a few years and they got rid of it because workers were miserable and sabotaging their workplace, and it just didn't work for anybody at any level of society, and he got rid of it. But it gives you a very extreme example of what happens when time is organized for A, continuous production, and B, probably deliberately to break up the family and civil society.
Right.
You segregate people temporally from one another.
Right, but it makes it obvious what time does. I mean, that's one of the things that's so good about this book. I don't really think about the weekend or time or the evenings as cementing the family. It just kind of is, right? It's just something that you do and you go through time and don't necessarily think about it. So when it's taken away, I guess you're forced to think about it, Right.
So in the book, I say that the Sabbath is a machine for manufacturing social solidarity.
Right.
What do I mean by that? I mean that if you say you were like the priest who wrote the Bible and codified the Sabbath in the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the Christian era, say you were trying to take a very uncohesive, very scattered, and probably pretty demoralized group, and restore a sense of community to them. and cohesion to them. I say the Sabbath is it's a darn good tool for doing that. Why? Well, first how does it work? It's a 4-step program, I say. First, you write laws to limit work time.
Mm-hmm.
Then you set aside one particular time that everyone doesn't work at the same time.
Right.
And that's how you create the shared time that we were talking about. Then you make sure that it happens regularly so that people get in the habit of it. And I have a whole riff in the book about the terrible importance of habit.
Uh-huh.
Very few things happen if they aren't habitual.
Right.
And then you make it festive.
Right. Right.
You make it. You make sure people eat, that they drink good wine and eat good food. And there are a lot of laws in the Tractate Shabbat about dressing up. Right. Wearing fancy clothes. It's a festive time. It's a fun time.
Right.
And, then you have one day a week. The week, of course, is a product of the Sabbath, so it's sort of funny to say then you have one day a week as if it were just an accident, because the week is created by means of this institution. But you have one day a week. Right. You have this happy day when everybody gets together and is relaxed and is themselves and has time for you, has time for books, has time for culture, has time for their children, and, of course, the primary consideration of the priest who wrote the Bible, time for God.
Right, right, right. And, you do come away, I know that the book is not a manifesto or sort of an in defense of the Sabbath, because as we've discussed, the ambivalence remains, but you do come away with a sense, and I was particularly touched that you guys keep the Sabbath, with this sense of its kind of urgency. I mean, would that we all could understand this even with and through our ambivalence and kind of, respect it in whatever our Sabbath is, because it does seem sort of ever more important, I mean, time use studies, which you talk about a little bit, even though time use studies say that we're not actually working more than we are actually working more than we are for all sorts of, reasons that people who have analyzed time use studies get into, so you do get a sense at the end of why this is so distinctly important, different from kind of.
And you talked about this study that I make a lot of. There's a famous, very, very famous study called the Good Samaritan Study. It was done quite a long time ago, nearly 40 years ago now. And it's features a bunch of seminary students, theology students, who were told by testers that they had to rush over from one building to the next and give a sermon. Mm-hmm. And along the way, and they thought the sermon was going to be the test, but along the way they encountered a man in distress slumped against a building, and the real test was to see how they responded to this man. And the study was conducted in the realm of what's called personality studies, the subdiscipline of psychology called personality studies. It wasn't done as a study of the effect of time on anybody. It was supposed to show that certain personality types would be more likely to stop and certain personality types would be less likely to stop. Well, the seminary students were not all told to rush over to the building to give the sermon. Some were told to rush over to the building, and some were told that they had some time and they could amble over to the building. And when the study was finished and the psychologists looked at the result, what they discovered was that different personality, the type of personality you had, based on the testing they had done of you beforehand, actually mattered a whole lot less in determining whether you were likely to stop than whether you were one of the group that was told to rush or one of the group told you had time.
Right, right.
And that when you feel that you're in a rush and that other people are counting on you and you've got to get things done, it is much harder for you even to put on your cognitive map. They talk about how some people just didn't even see this guy.
Right.
That there are people in distress.
Right.
And that when you are not in a rush, when you're not feeling stressed and like you're behind the clock, then you have time to stop and help.
Right.
And that helping, the ability to help others, to reach outside of yourself and help others, is actually a direct effect or directly correlates to how rushed you feel.
Right. And I have to say, I've heard this stuck with me because I do actually experience life this way at this moment, at this phase of my life, having 3 pretty small children and sort of 2 jobs. I feel that my goodness is very much constricted by time. And there are moments when I actually feel like there's a kind of immorality in my compressed time in terms of how I treat people and sort of the things I don't make time for. I definitely feel a huge moral component to my time and how I use it and spend it. So they're very closely connected for me right now. but I'd never quite thought of it that way. So that was very interesting. Now, there's a couple of big topics I just want to cover, and so let's just move on a little more to the history, which is the Christians and Sabbath, kind of the Gospel of Mark, which you talk about, and kind of how the Christian relationship with the Sabbath has sort of come full circle to the Puritan Sabbath. But just start with kind of what the Christians were trying to do and say about the Sabbath.
Well, I think Mark was trying to do and say something, and that everyone else followed. I happen to love the Gospel of Mark. It's really one of the greatest works of Western literature. Mm-hmm. It's an incredibly powerful text, mm-hmm. and I feel that most of the Gospel afterwards kind of, Paul is a different matter, but at least the three other Gospels mm-hmm. just kind of are pale imitations of Paul. So mm-hmm. I do this very close reading of Paul. And what's
of
key...
Mark.
Did I say Paul? Yeah. Mark.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What's key about Mark is that when you read Mark, you realize time has changed. Mm-hmm. The sense of time has changed. You are in the end time, and you are in a hurry. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is in a really big hurry. Mm-hmm. Because Jesus has this new order to announce, and this end time to announce, and he's got to get it out there fast. Mm-hmm. So the story of, there's a whole sort of covert story of Jesus' relationship to the Sabbath in Mark, which I tease out, because it's not, it doesn't seem like it's a gospel about the Sabbath, though the Sabbath figures into it, but I make it very much about the Sabbath. And I say basically, Jesus doesn't have time for the niceties of the Pharisaic Sabbath. And that's one of the reasons he offends the Pharisees so much, and that's why they step outside of the synagogue at one point and start hatching the conspiracy that will culminate in his crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the really big themes of the book of Mark, and then you can sort of see it in weaker form throughout the New Testament, is this clash between two orders of time. Mm-hmm. The order of time that says time has speeded up, you must be redeemed immediately, and the end time is coming and the time of judgment is coming. Mm-hmm. And the Jewish order of time, which is very plodding, mm-hmm. We talked about it with Kierkegaard, very plodding, very domestic, and there's very much this sense in at least domestic ritual.
Well, the quote from Narnia was really excellent on this front. I kind of want to read it. Let's see if I marked it some here. Do I have it?
I can find it. I have the book here if you want.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I really thought it was great. I mean, just in illustrating this point, he says, this is Susan's ride on the back of Aslan. Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great paws. Then imagine instead of the black and gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of the golden fur and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you're going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. And then this is a great part. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. That was great. I mean, that was a great illustration of that concept of time moving differently.
Right. I mean, C.S. Lewis was the great Christian apologist of the 20th century, and, the Narnia books are, Aslan is Jesus, and they are allegories of Christianity. So that, I take that. I thought he really had his finger on this Markian idea of time having speeded up in a wonderful, exciting,
kind of exhilarating, timeless way,
Thank you. Yes, exhilarating way, exactly. And there's this sense in the New Testament that you're just leaving Jewish time behind, and you're entering this much more charged, much more immediate, much more exciting time.
Yeah, it's like that versus the tax collector, for God's sake. Like, which one would you want to be? Which world would you want to be a part of?
Right. But I call the chapter "The Flight from Time" because I think and I don't get explicit about this, but I feel this very strongly, and I tried to do it through juxtaposition of different passages. I feel as though there's a way in which in our society we're in the same kind of flight from time. The strictures of time, the heaviness of natural time, daylight, nighttime. We've gotten rid of that with light, with artificial light, and the heaviness of sort of the old-fashioned rules of work time and of shopping time. and all of that. We've become very light, very Aslan-like in our ability to just rise above all these strictures and structures and just float in time. And I think it's very appealing. And in the end, I think it's very dangerous.
Oh, this is so interesting because you're right. This is, that phrase mobile time. It does sort of, it does bring this idea that you're kind of liberated from any kind of plotting time. So why do we experience this as oppressive, interestingly? Like, why is it dangerous? Just kind of elaborate on that.
I think the reason it is dangerous is, I think it's it's Stalin's continuous work week.
Right.
Is the danger. We wind up, the problem with this continuous mobile time is that we will erode the boundaries that were put in place to protect us, to protect, our time for each other, to protect our time away from work, to protect our time away from shopping.
Right.
There's no moment when you're checking your Gmail when you're not being monitored by Google and being,
right.
And having Google trying to sell you something.
Right.
There's no moment when you're not in that kind of instrumental relationship with them, or
right.
commercial relationship with them.
Right.
We're losing the ability to sort of recognize that there are other things, and that we need to make time for those other things, or we won't have them.
The Washington Post, I'm sure one could tell 10 million stories like this, but they had a story that got into this the other day, and the lead illustration was about a guy who was, he was doing a sort of chess move. He was in the middle of a chess move on his iPhone, and he saw sort of an opportunity to execute a particular chess move that came up at that moment, and, he was sort of so intent and fixated on, he was in the bath giving his daughter a bath, when suddenly he felt the water on his feet, because the bath had overflown. It was like a nice imagery of sort of what happens when, the plot, the sort of tick of the water kind of going to the bathtub, which is the plotting time. You become totally disconnected. You're living in your kind of completely own sense of space and time, and right. what weirdness happens out of that.
Right. There's this powerful dematerialization
right.
of the world that is sort of happening in this other time.
Right.
I have a whole riff about the space of places and space of flows. And let's not get too technical here, but yes, I think we're at risk of letting the world disappear out from under our feet.
Right.
And we need the world.
Right. Right. And that's
the
part
world
of this
needs
book.
us to have time for it, or it will disappear. Bad things will happen to it too.
Right. And I think that's the part of the book that's so kind of important and accessible. And, much of it is incredibly interesting, but that part is so kind of urgent and relevant. I had a lot of other things to talk about, but that's sort of rounded off. We're coming on the hour. The thing I think I want to end with is, just sort of where you are now, which is very interesting and complex, kind of in terms of a rabbi, in terms of your children, just kind of the place you've come to after all this intellectual exploration and thinking about this.
Well, there's two places I came to, and I'm going to give the plotting answer first and the better answer second.
Uh-huh.
The first place I came to is I knew that at some point I was going to have to issue policy prescriptions, because after all, it's a nonfiction book, and I decided I could. And I do. And the policy prescriptions I issue are, number one, in your own life, think about time. And number two, as a society, we need to do more to protect non-work time. We are the most I developed this principle, which I call Sabbatarianism. It's not like the Sabbatarianism of the Puritans. It's my own idea of Sabbatarianism. We are the least Sabbatarian nation in the world, from having actually been historically the most. That is, the United States.
Right.
And we do the least in terms of vacation time, in terms of family time, in terms of protecting people from shift work that breaks up their family and creates, the specter of Stalin's continuous work week with families never able to get together and things like that. So there are some things we can actually think about. I don't say these are the laws we must pass, because I don't know what laws we must pass. I'm not a legal scholar.
I like your flirting with the blue laws, though. I was kind of, I was tempted by that. That was, it was just a sort of half sentence, but still.
It happened. Amos Oz recently in Israel gave a speech in which he said, in Israel the Sabbath is either a religious Sabbath or a shopping Sabbath, and we need something in between.
Right.
And so does America, in my opinion. But what that would be, I think, I do not pretend to have the answer. It's like one of the most complicated questions there is. So that's the sort of plotting policy prescription place I end up in.
Uh-huh.
But the more interesting place I end up in is I keep the Sabbath kind of not that differently from the way I did when I started the book.
Uh-huh.
It would have been nice if I could have gone through this whole book and then been, super what we call Shomer Shabbat,
Uh-huh.
and kept the Sabbath like a good Orthodox Jewess. But I don't, and I never will, and I sort of come to terms with that. And I take from it the things that I think are really important, and those are, first of all, always staying in touch with the history of my people's time,
right.
of traditional time, of this very good idea, remembering in my everyday life this really, really good idea about time, and trying to honor it and figure out in the honoring what was being said to me.
Right.
And I do this on days when I don't, on Saturdays when I don't feel like doing this, I do this for my children.
Right.
As much as I do it for myself, which
right.
my children have figured out and are skeptical about.
Right.
Because my son, for example, says, has sort of figured out my own attitude about God and repeated it back to me without my ever having said it to him, which is that, God is a story somebody told somebody and then somebody told somebody else, and we've just all gotten in the habit of telling it to our children.
That was good.
It was, he was 6, I was kind of proud of the guy.
That was very good, yeah.
I know. And I sort of agree with him, but I try to, in the book, I try to turn tables on that and say, maybe that is God.
Right.
Maybe the stories we tell and the rituals we pass down and the ideas they contain and the traditions we've evolved over centuries to protect ourselves from ourselves, which, we need protection from ourselves. Maybe that is God.
Yeah, that's as close a description to my own belief as there is, I think, what your son said, I would say. But sort of the explanation I give to my children about why we're Jewish and why we do the things that we do on Friday night and why they go to Hebrew school and all that,
Yeah. Except my son worries that maybe he's wrong and God's going to punish him, but...
He'll worry until his, deathbed, that same thing, won't he?
Right.
Okay, so those are your policy prescription, and then for yourself, and is anything else about...
Well, so we really do... I'd say the thing that matters most for me coming out of this book is realizing that the Sabbath, even though the Sabbath, I started the book in a very lonely place,
mm-hmm.
and perhaps it's not a coincidence that I end up by saying, to me, the most important part of the Sabbath is the social part.
Right.
So we devote a lot of time to cooking,
right,
and finding good wine and beer and serving it and inviting people over and then cleaning up afterward. And we spend a lot of time in shul, which Hannah, if you ever go to synagogue, I don't know if you do, when you have small children, is fundamentally nothing more than a social experience because
right.
you can't pray at all.
Right.
Forget it. It's not going to happen.
Right.
And so it's a very fundamentally social experience, but a different kind of social experience.
But even that you dress up, it's so lovely. I mean, you actually said Friday morning and afternoon. I found that kind of amazing, really, that you cook in the morning and the afternoon and then get together in the evening. That was very impressive.
Yeah, well, we do. We cook all week. We're thinking about it all week. We're thinking right now we're having 16 people over tomorrow night.
Oh, well, that's a lot.
That's just, a bunch of them are kids, so we just throw the kids' food out on a separate table and ignore them. But, yes, but are we strictly Shomer Shabbat? No, we drive, we turn lights on and off. I'll tell you what we do though. And we're getting better and stricter about this because it just, as my kids get older, I just really see the value of it. We have an electronic Sabbath. There's no electronic media, no computers, no screens, basically.
Yes, I love that idea.
And my kids have been doing it. They don't really like it that much, but they've been doing it since they were really little. And we just, as new forms of temptation enter our household because the kids get older, I just keep saying no, and so far they accept it. Eventually, I suppose they won't, but it's just wonderful because we tell stories, we read books, we play games, we go outside, we go to friends, we talk to each other. We do not, there's not that much, media for the kids in my household, but there is some, but they don't get it on Saturday, and they know that and they accept that. And it becomes this time when you honor the real. Right.
Which is a lovely idea. I think that's the idea. If I'm going to take one rule from your book, that is it. Is the electronic, the banning of electronics on Sabbath seems like a fabulous compromise.
It is a good idea, though. It's pretty darn hard to implement, I have to tell you.
Right, because people associate that with relaxation, right? So
Right.
that's the hard part of that particular rule. I mean, you come home, you've had a long day, you sit down at the end of the night, you want to watch a little TV, right? So it's sort of deeply ingrained for those of us who don't have it on all the time. Well, thank you so much, Judith. That was
you, Hannah.
excellent,
This was
and the
great.
book is fabulous. And congratulations! And
Thank you.
and this was a great chat.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.